Hello, this is Thomas from Matters of Mind. I'm going over a new book today. It's The Great Mother by Erich Neumann. And this is part of my series where I go through books on Jordan Peterson's great book list. No particular order, just whatever order I feel like going in. And I'm going to do something a little different today. This is probably the third or fourth time I've tried to record this particular video. And what I keep finding is I keep containing myself to make it nice and quick, summary, 10, 12 minutes, so I'm kind of rushing through. But with the depth of information that needs to be conveyed in order for any of this to make sense, I keep finding I'm going over, and I keep trying to cut stuff out, and in the recording, I'm just rushing through things, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go through the information, and it's going to take as long as it takes. People stick around, great. If not, cut into two parts, or maybe not. And maybe that's not for you. Either way, I'm going to go through it, and I'm going to get started. So the book, The Great Mother by Erich Neumann, this is the copy that I read, and it's a sort of a next step from his previous book that I did a video and article on, The Origins and History of Consciousness. And the reason I'm even mentioning this and bringing it up is because I think in order for The Great Mother to make sense, you have to talk a little bit about origin of history and consciousness. If you don't know Erich Neumann, he was a student of Carl Jung and followed a lot of what Carl Jung did and expanded upon it, and so well that actually in The Origin of History and Consciousness, Carl Jung writes the prelude. I think that's what it was called, a foreword by Carl Jung, and essentially says that Erich Neumann has taken all of the information that Carl Jung gathered and put it into a concise, easy to understand form, essentially saying that he wishes that was the book he wrote. So if you're a fan of Carl Jung, you understand at least a little bit about Carl Jung's ideas, then that will help you through these books and help you to understand what Erich Neumann is pointing us towards. Now, one of the things that really struck me, just a little tidbit up front before we get into the details of the book, is how deeply embedded the concept of male and female is in our psyche. And I think it really pushes back against this concept that we are bombarded with today, where gender is a social construct that's only utilized to disempower us, where really it's the basis for everything in human culture, art, music, understanding the world that we live in, procreation. It's really the basic framework for which you can understand the objective world. And I think understands the key word, because generally I don't think they're trying to understand the world. They are trying to control it when they're actually pushing you towards blurring the lines between fundamental distinctions like that. So if we're going to look at the concept of the feminine archetype, which is really what The Great Mother is, the book itself, it's taking the origin in history of consciousness, focusing in on one particular archetype, which is the feminine archetype. Now, the idea of an archetype is whatever is representative of a category, and that could be something in art, it could be something in music. It's the idea that you have about what the feminine is. And that's going to vary with each individual and their experience and their time when they were born. But there is also a overall worldly or cultural archetype that takes all the pieces of those individuals and can be represented at least in bit, depending on who you are. Every feminine archetype that we see is going to have some representation of what we believe the feminine is. And an archetype can be a small archetype where it's an archetype of a very specific type of feminine or masculine, but there's also overarching archetypes which take all the aspects of the masculine or the feminine and can represent them in one archetype that encompasses the whole. And as we look at the difference between the specific archetype and the one that encompasses the whole, that's where we start to see the Great Mother. The Great Mother is essentially the very first feminine archetype that was later differentiated into all the other various archetypes of good and bad, good and evil, etc., that all came out from that very first feminine archetype, which is the Great Mother. Now, the way that I like to see this is as if Erich Neumann, the author, is an archaeologist of sorts. You know, one of the things that struck me is when I talked about the concepts in origin of and history of consciousness, somebody kept pushing back in my Medium piece saying, yeah, but it's still a myth, and, you know, this is a myth and that's a myth, and, you know, it doesn't really matter because it's not science and it's just a myth. But nobody would ever say that to an archaeologist. If an archaeologist spends a lot of time digging under the earth, bringing bowls and pieces of bowls and artwork, etc., and laying it all out and saying, here are the things that were produced by these people, and this is what it says about them. Now, we could debate what it actually says about those people, but we wouldn't debate that it says something about those people. Those things weren't created by them arbitrarily. People created bowls because they needed to put things in them, whether they be fluids or solids, and that tells us that they needed to carry things from place to place. The artwork that they choose to put on their walls or on the bowls or on their tools are going to tell us something about what was going on in their minds that was important to them in understanding their world, that they felt compelled to put on those items. So it's very similar to what an archaeologist does, but the goal is a little bit different. It's not just the culture that the people are steeped in. What Erich Neumann is trying to get at is first the origin of consciousness, going back as far as we can and seeing what people produced and what it says about what was going on in their minds, and then taking that from the beginning, almost like a timeline of what people were producing throughout time, and seeing what that means for what was going on in their minds and what it means for the development of consciousness. And in the particular book of the Great Mother, what he's doing is looking at the timeline of the development of the feminine archetype throughout history and throughout the world. So what he does is he looks at these artifacts and thinks, what does this tell us about how these people viewed the feminine archetype, and what was the archetype to them, and how does that now relate to the timeline for the rest of the world? That's the archaeological dig he's doing. He's digging through the minds of ancient people and telling us how they were thinking. It's a nice way to gain the ability to be empathetic towards ancient people, really understand what they were thinking and how that relates to our thoughts today. Now, I said that we're going to talk a little bit about the origin and history of consciousness, and here's why. I think it's helpful to understand that just a little bit so you can understand what the idea of the Great Mother is. So one of the things in the origin and history of consciousness that Neumann really gets into is the uroboros. So I'll put up a couple pictures of what that looks like. The essential idea is that it's a circle. That's the most important part. And what he shows us in Origins is that throughout culture and throughout history, different places in the world, cultures that never had any contact with each other, it's very common for some of the very first artwork and expression to be a circle. And the idea is that they're trying to understand the nature of the world. And when we say the nature of the world, it's helpful to think of it as the nature of the world created by human consciousness. Whatever it is that we're conscious of, that's our world. So to contain that, they create a circle. So it's almost like their subconscious is projecting the concept of a circle as a vision, and they're drawing it in the sand, they're drawing it in art, they're drawing it in paintings. And that starts to evolve into what we call the uroboros, which is often a snake eating its own tail. You also see the same idea with the yin and yang, where it's a circle. And if you think of a snake eating its own tail, you can see that's the same thing that's happening with yin and yang as well. All the cultures start, no, I don't know about all, but many cultures, some of their earliest artwork reflects the shape of a circle as the uroboros. Now, why it's important for it to be a circle is that it's a container. Everything that we think of as the human reality is contained within that. And I'd like to think of an ancient person thinking, okay, this is everything I know about the world, and it has a limit. So the circle is the limiting factor. And then I think of the circle as containing all of reality, whether it's physical or metaphysical reality. Everything is contained within that circle. It's almost as if the circle has a black sea within it, just of darkness. And I imagine, of course you can't really do this, but if you took all of reality at the beginning of time, how it was one specific dot, you take all of reality, all the people, all the animals, all the other matter, all the ideas, all the concepts, and you put them in a blender, spun it for a few minutes, pureed it up, and then poured it into that circle. That circle contains everything, and it's all mixed up like a wavy mess of dark fluid. There's no differentiation of one thing to another. It's all just mixed up, and there's no orienting principle. What I mean by orienting principle is there's no center, there's no top, there's no bottom. I know it's hard to think of and conceptualize because we created a circle, so of course a circle has a center to it, but just think of it as a wavy mess of everything, and there's no differentiation between one thing or the other. Nothing is yet defined until we get self-consciousness. Now, the level of consciousness probably pops up in a wave, I would think, where there are some people that get a glimmer of consciousness throughout the day, and it starts to seep back into unconsciousness. Because one thing we do know for sure about consciousness is that unconsciousness existed before consciousness. So I like to think of it as sleep and awake. We're conscious when we're awake, and we're unconscious when we're asleep. And consciousness starts to arise almost like we're coming out of a deep slumber. I don't think it would come up all at once, but in waves, and then eventually being conscious throughout the waking hour, particularly self-conscious. And once you get self-consciousness, it's like that circle with that dark liquid mass of all reality in it. That's unconsciousness, and that's the unknown. And then that little tiny speck of consciousness is a little bead of light that kind of starts to light up in the middle of that dark, tumultuous sea. And it reminds me of the cover of the book, because you can see it here, the light. And one of the things that he notes, and I've read other places, is that whenever we talk about consciousness, it's always a light. I mean, even in the Enlightenment period, there's this idea of coming to light, seeing the light. In the biblical narrative of creation, there's one of the first things that happens is, God says, let there be light. And in order for there to be darkness, there has to be light. So now you have a differentiation. So in that dark, tumultuous sea, we have that circle with all that fluid in it, all of reality, and a tiny bit of light, which is our self-consciousness. Now, the next thing we have to do is, as we're conscious and we start to look around at all this darkness, we start to want to understand our world. And the way we do that is by defining it. We have darkness and light. Now, we can see that mirrored in day and night, and up and down. And then we start to look at some of the most basic things about ourselves, male and female. So now that dark, tumultuous sea is starting to get a little clearer. It's almost as if we have a little circle around that little bit of consciousness, that little light, where we start to define things around us, and we make a bit of that tumultuous sea more known, more understandable to us. We get it. We have our own little circle within that circle of things we know. Now, this is why we think of the feminine as unconscious and the masculine as consciousness. Because everything that we don't know, all of the things that are new, all new knowledge, all new life, everything comes from that dark, tumultuous sea. Because that's what existed. That was everything. So everything new, everything that exists comes from that darkness. And as a human being, an ancient person, one thing you know for sure is that every new life comes from where? Suddenly, you may not even know that your sexual activity is what's creating this swelling in the belly of a woman. And what comes from that? New life. So one thing you do know is that new life comes from a woman. And then you start to reflect what you know about yourself onto the universe, what you're trying to understand. You take what you know to help you understand what you don't know. So all new life comes from women. All new things come from the feminine. That dark, tumultuous, chaotic scene of the unknown, that's the feminine, and that's where all the new things are coming from. So that's why the feminine is usually related to chaos, the unknown, the darkness. Now, I'm going to share this picture with you now. This is a schema from the book, The Great Mother. So what we're now doing is, as we move away from the origin of consciousness itself and the differentiation between us and everything else, and identifying everything new and unknown with the feminine, we start to define what that feminine is. And this is where the Great Mother moves away from origin and history of consciousness, because it looks at just that feminine aspect and the artwork and expression of that feminine aspect throughout history. It leaves the masculine alone and just strictly looks at what the feminine archetype is. And in this schema, I think it's really helpful to understand how that develops. Now, one thing I think that's helpful to understand with this schema is that red urn in the middle, that's the feminine. And you have all these things that are offshoots of it. You see the above and below, that's the heaven and the earth. And the earth, the feminine is contained in the earth. That's why we have Mother Earth, because all life comes from it. But then you have the masculine sun up above it, and that's one of the primary separations there. But then you see all the other things that are separating out from the feminine. But it's important to understand it like this, and I wish this was a little bit more animated, to where everything that you see surrounding that red urn at one time in the human mind was inside that red urn. As we start to define and differentiate, we take things from that red urn, which is that primary darkness, and we define it. And once we define it, we have to put it in its place. And we keep taking pieces to better define the world. And every time you define something, you differentiate it from everything else. Because you can't say something is black without defining what isn't black, which is white. You can't say something is above without assuming that there is the below. So that's why heaven and earth were some of the first things to separate, and why they're wider apart. And then all those intermediary things that were once part of that urn, part of that black darkness are in the inside, start to get spread out from that urn and differentiated accordingly. Now, this next picture that I'm going to share is called Venus of Willendorf, found in Austria in 1908. It's about 25,000 to 30,000 years old. So at least 25,000 years ago, people were creating these types of artifacts as a reflection of their views of what it means to be feminine, what the feminine archetype is. Now, what's important to understand about this is remember that the urn, the red urn, the feminine was a vessel. It's something that held and contained everything known to mankind. And it also is a nurturing force because everything comes from it and everything is fed from it, which is why that urn is deeply embedded in the earth. Not only does life come from that urn in the earth, but it's also fed and nurtured by that urn. And you can see in this picture of this Venus how the hips are wide, the breasts are enlarged, the figure is incredibly exaggeratedly feminine. And very often one of the things I learned is that these exaggerations aren't necessarily reflective of the women of that time. These are visions of the archetypal mother, who is, of course, has a larger midsection because she's incredibly fertile, and that's where new life comes from. And the larger that area is, the more life can come from that. The larger the breasts are, the more nurturing it is. So those are the key characteristics of the feminine in this archetype, and they're exaggerating those to exaggerate the nurturing and life-giving aspect of this statue. And it's not necessarily saying that people at this time, that's what they valued as far as beauty in other people and their mates, or that's how women generally were. It's really an exaggeration of the core characteristics of that archetype. So one of the things that I took from this book that was similar to what I took from the Origin and History of Consciousness, and even other things like The Hero with 1,000 Faces that Joseph Campbell wrote, or any writing on mythology or religion, is that there are really a lot of common things across all different cultures, people who never had any contact with each other, where they produce a lot of these same mythological concepts just in their own way. I mean, they may have different materials based on where they live in order to produce those things, and live in different places with different animals that help them to express those things. But a lot of the same themes arise. The darkness, the feminine, aspect of nurturing in the earth, the light, which signifies the beginning of consciousness. A lot of these things are similar across culturally. And I think that's where we get into the idea of the collective unconscious that Jung talks about. Now, sometimes I've talked a little bit about that, and people kind of balk at that idea because it almost sounds like a weird mythology, collective unconscious, like we're all connected, like some kind of hive brain. But I don't think of it like that. I think of it like everybody has a hand. And the purpose of my hand is to grasp things. You can do a lot more things with a hand than just grasp, but let's pretend that's the main purpose, is to grasp. Now, that means the purpose of your hand is to grasp. The purpose of everybody's hand is to grasp. So that thing has a purpose that we all share, and we all share some genetic backgrounds, the same evolution that got us to having hands that grasp. And the same thing goes for our legs, our heart, our organs. They all have the same purpose and the same history. So if that's the case for the rest of our body, then our brain also has the same, at least similar, if not same, purpose and function that would be consistent cross-culturally. So I like that idea because it reminds me that regardless of our differences, there's a lot of things that have to be the same based on the fact that we all have the same parts and have the same origin. So that collective of unconscious is more like saying that the unconscious mind, all of our unconscious minds evolved from the same place. So we all have some similarities in our unconscious. And the fact that all of these different types of artworks arise in different places that express these same ideas is more evidence that there's something similar with our minds and our unconscious that we all share. So if you're interested in this book, I think it's a great addition to the origin and history of consciousness. What it does is it really solidifies some of those concepts and gets into more of the details on one particular aspect of the archetypes that arise in the very beginning of our process of coming into consciousness and then defining and differentiating our world. And it's a good reminder of how deep those definitions and frameworks go into producing our world as we see it today. It's not something that we can just do away with at a whim. They're not going to go away. So I think really any attempt to do so by pop culture and social constructivist type ideas isn't going to go anywhere. I don't think it can go anywhere outside of being really annoying and harmful on some sense, in some sense. But I think it's just a matter of time before the theory bucks up against reality. Hopefully we don't get too hurt on the way there. Well, thanks for joining me here. Thanks for being patient. I really loved reading this book, and I love thinking about this stuff. If you have any comments, I'd like to see them in the comment section. If you haven't liked and subscribed already, please do that. It's really helpful to the channel. Next up is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Great book, super fast, easy read. Looking forward to talking about it. Have a great day.